Hello, my name is Dr. Michael Glass, and I'm the Regional Studies Association's Territorial Chair for the United States. The Regional Studies Association is a learned society concerned with the analysis of regions and regional issues. Through our international membership, we provide an authoritative voice of and network for academics, students, practitioners, and policymakers. You can find out more about the Regional Studies Association, including information on membership, funding opportunities, and events at regionalstudies.org. I'm pleased today to present a new installment of our Regionalists on Film series that introduces you to the work of established and emerging regional scholars and their scholarship. Today, it's my special privilege to introduce Professor Nichola Lowe. Professor Lowe is Professor in City and Regional Planning at UNC Chapel-Hill and is also a visiting professor in the Department of Human and Economic Geography at Lund University. Professor Lowe's research examines the institutional arrangements that can create more inclusive forms of urban and regional economic development. Her recent book with MIT Press is Putting Skill to Work, How to Create Good Jobs in Uncertain Times, which looks at the role of workplace intermediaries across the United States that help extend job pathways to workers at the bottom of the labor market. She was also a participant in the Regional Studies Association Research Network, Working Regions, Rethinking Regional Manufacturing Policy. Nichola, welcome.
Thank you, Michael.
Now, can I first ask how you became interested in researching regions and regional development?
Yeah, so it was probably around 20 years ago. It was when I was a master's student at UC Davis. At the time, I was working with Martin Kinney, and we had a research project that looked at the US-Mexican border, and particularly at factories that were located on the Mexican side. So they're called maquiladoras. And that's where they were assembling television and radios for the US consumer market. So our work primarily focused on decisions by larger corporations that were based in the US. And those decisions were in turn undermining Mexico's ability to expand and protect their own homegrown domestic consumer electronics industry. This was an industry where the companies were based further inland, so in and around Mexico City. The work that was being done on the border in those factories, it was cannibalizing resources, but it was also drawing policy attention away from this domestic industry. And it ended up undermining Mexican-owned television and radio manufacturing. So this is obviously a sad story. It's a story of industrial failure, but I didn't want to just stick with that story alone. I didn't want to paint Mexico and its economy as always on the losing side of globalization. And so I started to push with my dissertation work to find stories, counter stories of regional economic success within Mexico. And I found several of them. I ended up focusing my dissertation work in the city of Guadalajara. So this is a historic industrial region in the central area of Mexico. And I wanted to look at what they were doing to really push against globalization and deindustrialization by repositioning some of their legacy industrial clusters. And I ended up focusing on a very innovative state-run program. It was designed to help apparel and shoemaking firms, so manufacturers there, export to the US market, but not by focusing on these prominent retail markets or say the Walmarts of the world, but by intentionally sidestepping those to focus instead on these emergent design-oriented consumer markets in Southern California and other parts of the US Southwest that were mostly focused on the Latino consumer market. And one thing to note is that this was a time in the mid-1990s when there was a lot of interest in global value chains and really trying to map those networks. The assumption was that these large global buyers and retailers, especially from the US and Europe, that they were driving decisions up and down the supply chain and supposedly to the benefit of companies and communities in lower income nations like Mexico. And so what I wanted to do with my work was challenge that assumption. And I did so by uncovering alternative yet parallel upgrading pathways or channels, pathways that were being forged by these regional institutions that were also reshaping global value chains, and in ways that actually proved more helpful to these smaller manufacturers compared to what the global buyers could offer them. And so that's sort of where I got started in terms of regional focus. But I'd say that my work continues along that same trajectory, more so in the US context now, but it looks at how local and regional institutional actors and arrangements can shape and reshape economic opportunities, and especially in ways that elevate the standing of actors that might traditionally be overlooked or marginalized within more dominant economic development discourse and strategy.
So that sort of focus really demands a great degree of interdisciplinarity, and you're drawing on a number of different disciplinary strands in that work. Would you care to talk a little bit about how those strands come together and the approach that you're taking to those issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I am trained in urban and regional planning, and I also teach in that space as well. And for me, that really reinforces my responsibility to design my research to be in conversation and dialogue with the worlds of regional practice and policy. So, not trying to be overly critical nor remaining at sort of an arm's length, but instead using the lived concerns, the lived experiences of those working within regional economies, and that includes community actors, community advocates, using their concerns to really shape or direct what I look at, but also to help me think about how I formulate recommendations. I think being in planning means I'm also forced to be quite pragmatic in my approach to research and try and present the results in ways that are useful and relatable to those that are outside of our fairly insular academic networks. But as you know, planning, urban studies, it tends to be interdisciplinary. And that does mean that I'm able to draw inspiration from other disciplines and use that to help guide my work and also connect it to broader theoretical debates. So economic geography, it's definitely been an important disciplinary anchor over the decades, but I also borrow from economic sociology, political science. I find myself reading a lot of books in the anthropology of workspace. As a doctoral student, economic geography was very important for getting me to think differently about formal and informal institutions and also what were called untraded interdependencies. So that was really helpful as I was looking at some of these manufacturing clusters in Mexico, and then also in biosciences, which was an industry that I focused on during my postdoctoral fellowship in Toronto, and then also when I moved to the Research Triangle region here in the US about 17 years ago. But one of the things that I did find over the years is that, especially within the last 10 years, I found myself gravitating to sort of other disciplinary debates and maybe further away from the core of economic geography. And I think some of that has to do with a methodological turn, especially in the regional innovation subfield that tended to favor quantitative research rather than in-depth case studies and qualitative inquiry, which is more my methodological focus. But I am finding that there has been this important shift back, a sort of rebalancing, if you will. And I think that's driven in large part to growing interests in the question of human agency and its role in regional economic development. So for economic geographers, agency gets defined as purposeful, meaningful actions that are taken by economic and institutional actors in support of their surrounding economies. And when we start to think about agency, it becomes difficult to really reduce it to a single variable or data point. It also means that we have to use some kind of human interaction during the research process, meaning talking to real people, going to actual places, going there to understand how people there interpret and respond to complex, changing environments, and also being careful to describe agentic processes more fully and start to think about what they represent and signify. And for me, I think this concept of agency is so powerful because it means that as researchers, we can really start to also uphold or hold up actors that are often missing from the usual data sources, or worse still, that are wrongly treated as peripheral to regional innovation or economic resilience, when in fact their participation and engagement is an important contributor.
I think that's a great segue to talking about your recent book, Putting Skill to Work, and some of the work that's appeared in, for instance, regional studies that you've authored over the past few years. So in that work, you're looking at regional innovation systems and how those people at the lower end of the workforce are being impacted upon by state level policy differences. Would you care to say more about that and how these questions matter for regional development studies?
Yeah, so a lot of my work of late has really focused on the skills contribution of frontline manufacturing and construction workers in the United States. And this is a workforce that rarely holds a college or university degree, but because of that, they're often misclassified as unskilled. Mm-hmm. In recognizing their skills contribution, and this is something that my collaborator and I called their hidden talent, we're also able to engage a much larger debate around economic inequality and start to think about what needs to be done to address it. So for decades, the sort of standard explanation for rising income inequality in the United States, as well as in other liberal market economies, it's focused on this supposed skills mismatch or skills gap. And the assumption is that workers at the bottom of the labor market are stuck there because they lack in-demand skills or the right educational qualification. So in the lead up to the COVID pandemic, this was the dominant sort of policy focus, and it was the main reason given for income inequality, this skills mismatch that was said to be widespread. And it motivated efforts before the pandemic to more precisely measure skills, to capture which skills are no longer useful or relevant, to then codify more desirable skills, and do that through the formalization of credentials and industry recognized qualifications. And it's also led to a lot of criticism of public educational systems, and it's put added pressure on these already stretched institutions to be chasing after employers, to be trying to figure out how to revise their credentials, their curriculum, in order to better meet industry demands. So the pandemic economy, I think, has really shifted things, and it's allowed people to raise important questions about this skills-centric logic. And it's also forced us to recognize deeper, and I would say more insidious forms of inequality. And that includes recognizing that there have been policy and institutional actions that have been taken over the course of several decades that have intentionally chipped away at working conditions and eviscerated worker rights. And in the US, especially, events over the last few years have also forced us to acknowledge the continuing role of systemic and structural racism in this country. And that includes how the coded language of skill has been used over decades to justify racial occupational segregation and wage suppression. And that also means masking the hard work and ingenuity of workers of color. And so I think we are at this crucial turning point now. And I think it's going to be much harder to continue to scapegoat skill. Instead, we need to acknowledge the widespread failure of industry and of businesses to create quality jobs, to support career building opportunities. And I think we also need to find a way to shift the burden back to employers to uphold and extend job quality standards. But I do want to stress that I think it's easier said than done. And so for me, I think the real research challenge is for those of us who care about regional economies, regional studies, to use our research to begin to inform what that institutional response might look like and begin to uncover some of these institutional levers that exist at the subnational level. So I know that some scholars, people who I greatly respect, they will sometimes put a lot of pressure on labor unions and say what we need is simply to increase worker voice through greater labor union representation. And while I agree that that needs to be part of the solution, I think for me, as someone who has spent a lot of time studying smaller size firms in industries like manufacturing and also construction, I've come to the realization that we actually need a more nuanced approach that doesn't just focus on workers and jobs alone, but needs to recognize that businesses themselves are often struggling. Smaller businesses especially find themselves at the bottom of the supply chain or the bottom of that subcontracting heap or pile, if you will. And that means that they themselves are getting squeezed by powerful economic forces and actors. And so for me, this really creates an opportunity for us to begin to explore how we might intentionally combine economic and workforce development efforts, not treating these as separate or competing policy spaces, but really trying to figure out how to more closely align them in order to improve economic mobility for frontline workers while also helping improve business performance at companies where they work.
I think that ties really well to what you were saying earlier on about that responsibility for dialogue, and the types of people that you're dialoguing with are going to have a really impactful role in the types of policy decisions that are made. Now, maybe I can finish up by asking you to take a step back, and as you're reflecting on your own scholarship, to also assess perhaps the broader field of regional scholarship, something that you've implied during our conversation so far. But what do you think are the opportunities and the challenges that regional scholars could address moving forward?
Yeah, so I had this incredible opportunity to spend last semester at Lund University in Sweden. And as part of that visiting professorship, I had a chance to interact frequently with doctoral students in human and economic geography, many of them focused on issues related to regional studies. And this is a group of emergent scholars that has been academically raised during the pandemic, also in close proximity to Russia and facing a lot of uncertainty as a result. And that could create a lot of anxiety, ambivalence, even paralysis maybe for this rising generation of researchers. But what I discovered during my discussions with them was really inspiring. And I think it is something that all of us who care about regions need to be paying more attention to as well. They seem to be making peace with uncertainty and with indeterminate futures. They're recognizing that conditions will change and will shift in the face of yet unknown challenges and crises, whether those are health or climate related or the result of human conflict or human greed. And I think that's where regional scholarship should be heading. So not just looking at changes or actions retroactively and sort of interpreting those, but finding ways to be more forward looking and with it to contribute to and inform reimagined futures. So these graduate students, they were working on a range of really profoundly important issues for humanity. So there was the decarbonization of the global shipping industry, for example, switching out municipal energy systems. So moving from polluting forms that are based on waste incineration to more sustainable sources. Migrating communities, and I don't just mean individuals or individual households, but moving entire town centers because the earth below has shifted or become uninhabitable. And that means that they're actually giving us a glimpse of our earthly future. But what I found is that this new generation of scholars, they're not waiting around for policies to be finalized in order to study them, nor are they waiting for the new political order to be etched in stone. They're not waiting around for the perfect data set, for example, but they're also not waiting for approval from an older generation of scholars that maybe is slower to realize what we need to be thinking about in terms of what lies ahead. And I think that we need to be helping them and we need to be recognizing what their insights are. We need to be raising their visibility, but also recognizing that they're taking on some risk here in terms of their research approach. They're willing to push themselves into emergent challenges. They're inserting themselves into ongoing processes. They're studying formative, perhaps fleeting stages of yet unproven developments. And so I think we need to be very supportive of what they're doing and also allow ourselves to be comfortable with engaging some of that uncertainty and helping to support them as they sort of explore the road ahead.
Oh, that's a great sentiment. Thank you. That's all the time we have available to talk with Professor Lowe, but I'd like to thank her for joining us to share a perspective on regional scholarship. I'd also like to encourage all of you to learn more about regional studies and the Regional Studies Association at regionalstudies.org. Professor Lowe, would you care to have the last word today?
Thank you, and I'm looking forward to hearing other contributors to this session.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much.